Well, welcome everybody. I'm delighted that you all came to do this, to listen to David talk about his book. And I get to hold it up. Important book, as we'll see. And you all have an opportunity to buy it if you want on the way out, and he'll be signing it. So please take advantage of that. I've actually read it. I have had a conversation with a colleague who does some of these events and who said that she never reads the book. She just calls the author up the night before and says, oh, does that help? No. I'm echoing back there. I have no idea what's going on. Just keep going. She said, you know, I don't read the book. I just ask the author, what should I ask you? But in this case, I read the book and I kept reading it because it's fascinating. And so I recommend it to you. And we're going to spend some time talking about it. It's really a history of what's happened the last 30, maybe 40 years to the global economy and to U.S. politics about trade. And we all know right now, the politics of trade is on the front page every day. David's on the front page many days. And it makes it a book that's not only important, but I think very timely. David Lynch is the Post's, Washington Post's global economics correspondent. He came there in 2017 from the Financial Times, where he covered white-collar crime, which is a little bit different from trade, but there may be some similarities from time to time. No specific references there. Previous to that, he was a senior writer with Bloomberg News, focusing on the intersection of politics and economics. He also followed the global economy for USA Today, which is when I first met him, I think, a long time ago, where he was the founding bureau chief in both London and Beijing. He covered the wars in Kosovo and Iraq. The latter as an embedded reporter with the Marines, and was the paper's first recipient of a Nieman Fellowship at Harvard University. So he has a long and distinguished career in journalism. He's also the author of When the Luck of the Irish Ran Out, and has a master's degree in international relations from Yale, and a BA from Wesleyan University in Connecticut. And those of you that read the Post see him frequently these days because trade is, we used to joke on our podcast that, you know, for years we were, you know, in the business section below the fold. And now we're in the front page above the fold thanks to the president. And it means that David has ended up being very, very busy, not only writing the book, but reporting what's happening each day. So what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it over to David. I've got a few slides. He's going to summarize the book briefly for you. He and I are going to have a conversation, and then we've got time for you all to ask questions. So David.
Great. Thanks. Good morning. Thanks, Bill, for that generous introduction. I'm honored this morning to be able to launch my book here at CSIS, an institution that I've relied on for information and analysis throughout my reporting career. I also want to take a moment, though, to acknowledge the support of the Wilson Center, which awarded me a research fellowship while I was writing the book. Mark Kennedy, who directed Wilson's WABA Institute for Strategic Competition, was my host at the center, and I very much appreciate his help. Now, The World's Worst Bet tells the story of the transformation of the global economy over the past 30 years through the eyes of a representative group of Americans: a factory worker, an activist, a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, a CEO, a journalist turned policymaker, and two presidents. In telling this tale, I draw on my personal reporting experiences over the past few decades, declassified government documents, and interviews with more than 125 officials, former officials, business executives, and trade experts. Now, the story begins in the 1990s, with the Cold War over, democracy and free markets spreading all over the world, and U.S. leaders optimistic about the future. Globalization, they say, will deliver a double-barreled win for Americans: shared prosperity at home and peace abroad as nations like China and Russia open up their political systems and join a US-led international order. But today, that's not where we've ended up. Instead, the US has turned its back on the global integration that made it wealthy. China and Russia have doubled down on state control of their economies, and experts are warning of a new global divide. So what happened? How did the triumphalism and hope of those initial post-Cold War years lead us to the rise of economic nationalism, populism, and conflict today? These were the questions that motivated me to write the book. I started working on what became the world's worst bet in late 2022 as I was preparing to cover the G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. At the time, I was struck by the contrast between the atmosphere surrounding that gathering and the mood at an earlier global summit that Bill Clinton had hosted in Denver 25 years earlier. That was the first meeting of the so-called G8, the 7 advanced democracies, plus Russia. And Boris Yeltsin attended as the embodiment of hopes for Russian democracy. A few weeks after the summit, in another sign of the incredible changes that characterized that era, Chinese President Jiang Zemin, still the leader of the Chinese Communist Party at the time, rang the opening bell on Wall Street. The Bali gathering, on the other hand, symbolized only global disunity as Vladimir Putin stayed home and Xi Jinping proved prickly on a number of issues. Indeed, by that time, it was apparent that little about globalization had gone according to plan. Voters, soured by their experiences with trade and immigration, gave populist Donald Trump an unlikely White House win in 2016. Global trade as a share of GDP, after growing steadily for nearly 50 years, had flatlined since 2008. As you can see there, supply chains proved vulnerable when stressed, and the US-China relationship, once cooperative, had deteriorated into an uneasy cold peace. These were the results of the bet that US leaders effectively first made in the 1990s, which was that we could enjoy the benefits of globalization without really worrying too much about the costs. This is what I call the globalization gamble. Now, it's important to say that globalization, which I define as the easy movement across borders of goods, services, money, people, and ideas, delivered enormous benefits, both globally and in the United States. What I call the greatest engine of global prosperity the world has ever known lifted 1.5 billion people out of crushing poverty. Most of them were in the developing world, but Americans benefited too. Certainly my life has been immeasurably enhanced by this phenomenon. I lived overseas for almost 8 years in Beijing and London and had a chance to report from more than 60 countries. Life-changing experiences. Now, I and Americans in general enjoyed lower priced goods from China, which helped keep inflation under control for more than a decade, along with a wider choice of everyday products and a better mix of jobs. I grew up in Connecticut in the 1960s and can remember when fresh corn on the cob was something you could get your hands on about 6 weeks every summer if you were lucky. Today, if you fancy corn on the cob in the middle of a February blizzard, you can get it, thanks to trade with places like Mexico. But while the gains from globalization were significant, our leaders overlooked, downplayed, or were slow to address the costs. Low-skilled factory workers who lost their jobs and lacking adequate government aid struggled to find their footing in a globalized economy. Supply chains optimized for low cost that buckled under pressure. Unfettered global capital flows that created crises in the developing world and later aggravated our own housing bubble. And finally, the rise of China, a strategic rival that proved more determined than expected to maintain both its authoritarian political system and its non-market economy. To varying degrees, these developments were foreseeable and could have been mitigated by different policy choices. Bill Clinton, I think, had it right when he said, globalization is a fact, not a choice. So in my view, the problem was not globalization itself so much as how we chose to respond or not to respond. Let's consider these issues one at a time. American factory workers with the least education and fewest skills lost out to people overseas who were willing to work hard for far less money. China's economic rise spread benefits across the entire U.S. economy like frosting on a cake. But what became known as the China shock cost the jobs of an estimated 2.4 million Americans between 1999 and the year 2011, according to a groundbreaking study by Autor, Dorn, and Hansen in 2016. And you can see the effect here. But taking into account how companies also benefited from access to inexpensive Chinese products in this period, more recent research concluded that the U.S. actually saw a net gain in jobs of 1.7 million. But whether it's a modest loss or a modest gain, I don't think the aggregate numbers really tell the story. A couple of million lost jobs measured against an economy that in those years employed around 130 million people would not have been all that consequential, except that the losses were concentrated among specific groups in specific communities. So for workers without a college degree, the China shock meant declines in their inflation-adjusted weekly wages every year for almost a decade. Laid off factory workers who were able to move to other types of work found themselves years later earning 40% less than colleagues who had remained in manufacturing. Now, nothing much was done to ease the transition for these Americans, even though politicians repeatedly promised that they would be taken care of. The principal government program that was supposed to help, called Trade Adjustment Assistance, was notoriously inadequate, and everyone knew it. Only 1/3 of workers trained under the program found jobs in the fields for which they had been trained. The program was especially ineffective for older workers, who arguably were the ones most in need of help. A Labor Department-funded evaluation found that laid-off workers were better off finding jobs on their own rather than even participating in TAA. And the program also maintained an artificial distinction between Americans who lost their job as a result of trade and those who became unemployed for some other reason. Now, I tell the story in the book of a Goodyear tire plant in Union City, Tennessee, which closed amid a surge of inexpensive Chinese tires into the U.S. The plant's demise illustrates both the human cost of economic change as well as the complexity of issues that are often described in our political debates in black and white terms. Chinese imports were certainly part of the story behind Goodyear's closing, but so were automation and questionable choices by both management and labor. This was the only time that the federal government, under President Obama, invoked a trade measure that was supposed to protect American workers from a deluge of Chinese imports, but these so-called safeguard tariffs that were imposed ultimately did little good. Now, however one apportions relative blame for the Tennessee plant's fate and the fate of so many others similarly situated, it was the nearly 2,000 workers who were let go and the community they supported that paid the price. After the plant closed, many of these workers eventually found new jobs, but they paid only half of what they'd been making at Goodyear. Kent Greer, one of the workers I profile, was lucky enough to transfer to a Goodyear plant several hundred miles away, but the frequent travel back and forth put enormous stress on him and the family he left behind in Tennessee. Now, in my interviews, the architects of the U.S. response to globalization in both parties acknowledged that they got some things wrong. When I suggested to former President Clinton that the U.S. had failed to keep its promise to help workers adjust to a globalized economy, he said without hesitation, "I agree with that." Now, I consider Clinton the godfather of U.S.-led globalization. He steered the 1994 North American Free Trade Agreement through Congress and celebrated China's entry into the World Trade Organization a few years later. He always said that while globalization would make the United States richer, there would be individual winners and losers. But Clinton also said that the winners would help the losers with training, relocation assistance, whatever they needed to take advantage of the new opportunities that globalization created. The problem is that never happened. Something else, budget deficits, the war in Iraq, the desire for good relations with a rising China, always took precedence over the needs of disadvantaged workers. And that failure, as Clinton had warned, eroded support for continued trade liberalization and had broader political consequences here in the United States. Those consequences, as I describe in the book, ultimately landed right on the former president's doorstep. Hillary Clinton's defeat in 2016, among other things, represented a rejection of the global economy that her husband had promoted, shaped, and nurtured while president. Now, at the same time, companies that focused primarily on lowering costs made their own risky bets in the way they structured their global supply chains, embracing a just-in-time philosophy that left little margin for error in manufacturing operations and that eventually left them dependent upon Chinese suppliers for critical needs. There were repeated warnings about the risks involved in this strategy: natural disasters, labor actions, and even armed conflicts that interrupted the routine flow of global commerce. The year 2011 provided a pair of alarms. The Fukushima earthquake and tsunami in Japan, followed a few months later by a historic monsoon in Thailand. Just one example of the impact. The only factory in the world that produced something called xerylic pigments, which give auto paints their distinctive glitter, stood in the shadow of Japan's Fukushima nuclear reactor. The interruption of manufacturing in the affected area led within 10 days to the closure of a General Motors plant in Louisiana, which triggered layoffs at a second GM plant in upstate New York, showing how global supply chains can spread risk as well as benefits. And just as manufacturers were recovering from the Japan disaster, epic flooding from the Thai monsoon inundated more than 1,000 other factories. The electronics industry was especially hard hit. Companies like Seagate and Western Digital saw their stock prices plunge by 40%. But despite these episodes and others like them, companies made few changes in their supply chains, and we all suffered the consequences during the pandemic. I explore these issues through the eyes of a woman named Revathi Advaithi, the CEO of Flex, a contract manufacturer for companies like Apple, Ford, and Johnson & Johnson. She steered Flex through the pandemic disruptions with nonstop Zoom calls, advanced data analytics, and industrial improvisation. At one point, Flex specialists used a virtual reality system to film a ventilator production line in Pennsylvania step by step so that it could be swiftly recreated in a vacant facility in Mexico. Though Flex navigated the worst of the 2020 supply chain crisis, the global landscape for such companies has only grown more complex amid proliferating tariffs and geopolitical risks. Just last month, a Flex factory in Ukraine was struck in a Russian missile attack that followed the Trump-Putin summit in Anchorage. As the U.S. trade deficit mushroomed in the early 2000s to an unprecedented 6% of GDP, we also erred in our approach to the corresponding capital flows. Two rivers of money flowed into the U.S. in this period, one from Europe and one from Asia, both driving financial globalization to unhealthy levels. Asian countries recycling their trade surpluses into U.S. assets bought up all of the new Treasury and Fannie and Freddie debt issuance between 2003 and 2007. All of that foreign capital kept 10-year Treasury yields here nearly a full percentage point lower than they otherwise would have been. Now, why is that important? Lower Treasury yields meant lower mortgage rates, which enabled a boom in cash-out mortgage refinancings that by ultimately providing consumers with extra cash, these capital flows helped inflate our bubble. At the same time, as Asian demand was pushing those yields down on treasuries, other investors like European banks chased higher returns by moving into investment products that they mistakenly believed were just as safe as treasuries, particularly private label mortgage-backed securities issued by U.S. investment banks. European demand for these securities encouraged Wall Street to continue producing these investment products, which were billed as transforming risky subprime mortgages into safe securities, and yet which were at the center of the 2008 crisis. Regulators in London and in Europe adopted from the United States what was called a light touch approach to bank regulation, which allowed their banks to take greater risks while holding less capital in reserve. Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan celebrated the growth of securitized bank loans as a way of dispersing risk around the world. In fact, the practice turned out to concentrate risk in unforeseen ways that nearly collapsed the global financial system. Now, to be sure, domestic considerations, lax lending standards, bank management errors, etc., were the primary drivers behind the U.S. housing bubble. But the extraordinary amounts of foreign capital flowing into the American economy in those years made the bubble and subsequent crash worse. Finally, U.S. policymakers also were overly optimistic about prospects for political change in China and the likelihood that expanded trade would cement a more peaceful world. Now, this is not to say that anyone literally expected China to become a Jeffersonian democracy or that this was ever a formal objective of U.S. policy. But the public rhetoric at the dawn of this era, the way trade liberalization was sold to American voters, leaned heavily on this sort of post-Cold War euphoria. At the end of his 1998 trip to China, Clinton was asked if he thought there could be a democratic China. And he said, quote, "Not only do I think there can be, I think there will be." And he went on to suggest that the country's leadership at the time, Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, would be the ones to bring it about. Presidential candidate George W. Bush, likewise, had high hopes for trade as a liberalizing force in the world. And on the Senate floor in the fall of 2000, as Congress debated granting China routine trade status in the U.S. market, then Senator Joe Biden was among many who saw few risks ahead. Other senators from both parties also spoke of a link between greater trade and quote-unquote democracy in China. Yet within a few years of China's entry into the WTO, it was evident that reform momentum was ebbing in Beijing. As Susan Shirk has written, China's hardline turn actually began years before Xi Jinping took office in 2012. The crackdown on internal freedoms, turn toward a more state-dominated economy, and greater foreign policy adventurism all began under Xi's colorless predecessor, Hu Jintao. The U.S. was slow to respond to the rise of a strategic rival and slow to address the consequences of a non-market economy that challenged the global trading system. I write about how these changes played out through the experiences of two men, Tim Draper, a prominent investor from Silicon Valley, and Matt Pottinger, a Wall Street Journal reporter who quit journalism and became a policymaker in the first Trump administration. Both men grew disillusioned with China. Pottinger was smacked around by Chinese security personnel in Beijing and was detained while reporting on a corrupt steel project out in the countryside. Draper made $1 billion on an early investment in Baidu, China's answer to Google, and was so enthusiastic about China that he even considered moving there at one point. But a decade later, after Chinese authorities had repeatedly harassed another of his portfolio companies for reasons that appeared linked to politics and or corruption, he quit the country in disgust. To show how much the conventional wisdom about globalization changed over the last 30 years, I introduced two final characters, Lori Wallach, a prominent political activist, and Joe Biden, whose policies on trade were closer to those of Donald Trump than to those of his fellow Democrat, Bill Clinton. Wallach's story is, I think, particularly instructive as she moves over this period from being an outsider trying to mobilize what she describes as corporate-led globalization to a relative insider who wields influence with both the Biden and Trump administrations. So why does any of this matter now? We can't go back and undo the damage to those who were left behind. Well, it matters because globalization is not ending, it's changing. And we need to learn the lessons of the past in order to cope with whatever is coming next. Because the China shock will not be the last time that profound economic forces upend the lives of Americans. Just think about artificial intelligence. And our system for helping workers navigate such tumult is nearly as flimsy today as it was when China first came on the scene a quarter century ago. Both political parties seem focused on recapturing lost manufacturing jobs, although most economists will say that's unlikely to actually happen. Instead, in my view, we should devote more attention to trying to develop a more robust social safety net and find ways to make services jobs, where most Americans actually work, attractive for those who in an earlier time might have been drawn to factories. To conclude, we've embarked on a new era of what I think of as a la carte globalization. It will be at least as difficult to manage as what we've already been through, but if we ignore the lessons of the past, it may not be manageable at all. Thanks for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you for that. That's a great summary of the book. I've got a few questions. You've answered a lot.
I thought you might.
You've answered most of them actually in your remarks, but I'll press forward with some of them anyway, and then we'll have a chance for the audience in a few minutes to weigh in as well. You've got the Clinton quote. It's a fact, not a policy choice. And I understand that you agree with that, basically.
I do. Largely because of the impact of technology in facilitating globalization. You go back and you look in that period, and I'll try to quote these numbers from memory. They may be accurate, they may not be. But at one point early in the 90s, something like 3 million people globally had access to the internet. And 5 years later, it was 100 million. And the number was doubling every year. And that kind of technological change, that kind of change in telecommunications, facilitated a lot of the disaggregation of manufacturing work in particular, and also just encouraged greater commerce across borders. So I think Clinton's exactly right, and that's why I say I don't think the problem is so much globalization in general or trade in specifics. It's what we did or didn't do in response.
But you're also not subscribing to one of the popular themes these days, which is that it's all dead.
No, I think it's clearly not dead, in part for one thing we didn't talk about, which is my fault, and one thing the president never talks about, which is his fault, is the services sector, which is globalizing increasingly. Richard Baldwin in Geneva has written a lot about this. Growth in services, imports, and exports is growing at a rapid clip. Those are harder to block, not impossible, but they're harder to block with tariffs or the kind of trade barriers that the administration's thrown up, and that's expected to only continue going forward. And even merchandise trade, we now have the highest tariffs since the 1930s in the U.S. with exemptions that's probably applying to roughly half of our trade, let's say. Supply chains globally are going to reorient themselves in response to that, but the rest of the world is still enthusiastically trading. China is finding other customers for the stuff that they would have been sending to us. And if we end up in a trade regime where we stay with high tariffs for a long period of time, the rest of the world will continue without us.
Well, I think that's a good point. What we said about it here at CSIS is that the tools that enable it have not gone away. The enormous reductions in the cost of transportation and communication, containerization, and digitization of the economy, the global internet access, all these things are not going to be uninvented.
Right.
They're still here, and people are going to take advantage of them one way or the other. And trade is, there's a lot of obstacles that get erected along the way, many of them right now tariffs, but people seem to find ways to get around them. I think I want to talk about the politics of this first. Basically, I've got three topics. I want to talk about the politics of this domestically, and then we spend a little time on China, and then talk about some a grab bag of other things at the end. The politics of it seems to me are, and you alluded to this, the fundamental dilemma is that the losses of trade just tend to be short-term and specific, and the gains tend to be long-term and diffuse. So people are benefiting because their T-shirt costs less, or because they can get corn on the cob in February. But the guy who lost his job in a factory when the factory moved to Mexico has a much more immediate issue. That gets to then right now with the arguments about globalization, and I wanted to ask you about that. The argument of the left, and I have to say I enjoyed your story about Lori Wallach, whom I've known for a long time. She's the only person who managed to have dinner with me and picket me in the same week, and which is a tribute to something, I guess. But the argument of the left and of the Biden administration is that trade agreements have benefited large corporations and their CEOs at the expense of workers. The Trump narrative says that trade has hurt the workers as well, but he blames the foreigners who are stealing our jobs, undermining our economy, and compromising our security. So they end up at the same place. Trade is a problem, but they have a different narrative as to what the source of the problem is. Who's right?
Well, I'm not persuaded by the argument that says that foreign countries, some as small and poor as Lesotho or Cambodia, have been conspiring to take advantage of naive American diplomats and trade negotiators, and have somehow ended up with a world where we nonetheless are the richest economy on the planet. It's hard for me to take that terribly seriously. But I think the distributional costs are, in my way of thinking, it's not that, it's less that it's corporations and their CEOs who have benefited, although they have, and workers writ large have suffered. It's that, globalization's been, as I said, the benefits spread like frosting on a cake. So we've all benefited. Even the workers who lost their jobs benefited, although it was faint consolation. But we did nothing, or next to nothing, to address these distributional costs, in part because they weren't fully anticipated. I quote a study by the ITC as China was on the verge of joining the WTO, and I think the forecast was imports from China would rise by 7%. They rose by 25% the first year and by 50% in the first 3 years. So part of this was a failure to anticipate what was coming. I think we spent a lot of time anticipating how much China would be changed by greater trade, and we didn't spend adequate time thinking about how we might be changed by it. And as a consequence, didn't prepare and didn't do much about it. So those distributional costs are the thing that, to me, are the glaring failure, and that some economist, Paul Krugman now has written, he wrote a piece a few years back saying, economists of the time were looking to the experience of trade between one advanced economy and another advanced economy, so the US and Germany, and using that to forecast or model what would be coming as we integrated with Mexico and China. And of course, that was wrong. And Krugman said it at the time, if we had known what was coming, we would have done things differently.
Well, hindsight is always 20/20, I think. But, in contemporary political terms, how much of the trade debate is really the left and the right ganging up and shooting the center? Or is there no center left to shoot at this point?
Well, I mean, if by the center you mean folks who would like to go back to the pre-2016 world, I think that world's gone. So whether the senator's still here or not, there's got to be a new pitch, a new sales pitch. I don't think it's enough to repeat the arguments that have been made in support of globalization and trade without addressing the problems. Because rightly or wrongly, people associate what happened over the past couple of decades with a whole cocktail of factors, trade being one. Trade's not the only thing that went wrong. And I'm not a big fan of single variable explanations. But you're going to have a hard time getting elected to something in the industrial belt of the country, which are still electorally vital states, if you don't have an answer to what went wrong over this period.
Well, let's pursue that for a minute. Both Biden and Trump have been really focused on restoring American manufacturing, which conveniently is in the states you're talking about, in particular, which are politically important, among other things, but also there's a lot of jobs at stake here. But they also both tend to define manufacturing as, I think, traditional manufacturing. They talk about steel, they talk about autos, they talk about machinery, the old, I did a column on this, Lost in the 50s tonight, and there's something in that. Is that kind of restoration of that part of our economy really a feasible goal when 75% of our economy is now services?
The short answer is no. I mean, any economy, well, I shouldn't say any, most economists would say, first of all, there's no precedent for any advanced economy reversing the decline in the share of its workforce that works in factories. And, we saw the same thing with agriculture over time. We needed fewer and fewer people, thanks to mechanization, to produce the food that we consume. Those people left the farms, went into factories, and since, I think, 1950, the percentage of, or early 50s, the percentage of workers toiling in factories once was 1 out of 3, it's now about 8%. Now, if you spent unlimited amounts of money subsidizing manufacturing and put up unlimited trade barriers, could you get 8.3% up to 9% or 10%? I guess so, if that was your sole objective in running the economy. But it wouldn't be a terribly efficient use of money. Now, I think what makes sense to me is addressing specific national security vulnerabilities. I don't think you want to still be in a world, given the state of our relations with China, where you're dependent on China for rare earths, right? Which we need to make the magnets that go into everything from smartphones to jet fighters. So there are specific vulnerabilities that probably are worthy of government support and attention. But the effort, and you're right to attribute it to both parties, this fixation on manufacturing is, I think, ahistoric, and it also goes against the sort of trends in the economy. We've got 400,000 vacant manufacturing positions today. We can't get people to fill them. If all these factories came back that the president would like to see return, we don't have the workers to staff these factories. And inevitably, the type of manufacturing that makes sense to do here is going to be heavily automated and is going to require greater skills than the high school graduate with no training who in the 1950s or 60s or 70s could just walk into a steel plant and get a job.
Yeah, I think part of this too is choices that people make and what their aspirations are. We had a group of high school students here later, near the end of the last semester, from DC, and we were talking about this, and we were talking about globalization, industrialization. These all happened to be kids that either they were international kids. They either had one or both parents were born in another country, and some of them were probably born in another country as well. But I ended up asking them, how many of you want to work on an assembly line? Nothing. No. On the other hand, I think they probably all want to be TikTok influencers, which is probably not a very realistic.
Well, and the other thing, what gave manufacturing its economic cachet, if you will, was dollars and cents. Those jobs used to pay more. There was what was called the manufacturing wage premium. That disappeared as of about 10 years ago. The Fed has done studies of this. So, there was a time when it made sense to both bemoan the loss of those jobs and maybe aspire to have more of them, but that's gone now. And one of the stories I tell in the book, which I think illustrates this, are a father-son who I met out in Ohio in 2008. And they worked for a factory in Niles, Ohio. The private equity firm came in, shut down, literally moved all the manufacturing equipment to Mexico. The last thing these guys did was train the Mexican workers to work on their equipment. And it was a real tale of sort of future and past. The father, who was in his 50s, went and got another job at a GM plant in Lordstown. It was backbreaking work. He had a few medical issues. He's in his late 50s. He's on the assembly line, struggling to keep up. Ultimately went on disability, where he remained for years. His son, who was only about 30, took some retraining, went back to school for a couple of years, got a nursing degree, went to work for one of Ohio's biggest healthcare providers, making almost as much as he was making in the factory to start, and then over time worked his way up into a supervisory position, making six figures. Now that's a success story. He didn't get back in the factory. He got a new services sector job in a growing sector. He'd probably never have to worry about being out of work again for his career, making damn good money. And it seems to me that points the way to more profitable and productive venues to worry about.
Yeah, there's a myth, that still goes around, and you've just helped explode it, which is that all services jobs are fast food jobs, minimum wage. And in fact, it's more complicated than that.
Sure. And, some of them are crappy jobs that you don't want, but some of them are doing great, important things.
You don't have a lot of choice either, but...
Sorry?
When you're 15, you don't have quite as many choices.
True.
But, let's talk for a few minutes about China, because that looms large in the book and large in everything we're talking about right now. Could anything have prevented the China shock, do you think?
Let's break it down.
If we left them out of the WTO, for example?
Sorry?
If we left them out of the WTO?
No, I don't think that was ever a real possibility, and it wouldn't have made any sense. It's not that we could have kept them out of the WTO or should have. That wouldn't have been a sustainable strategy. It's not that we could have prevented the economic rise of China, which I think of as sort of the phenomenon here we're talking about more than the specific, almost administrative matter of joining the WTO. Could we have prevented the rise of China? Of course not. The way I think of it very simplistically is the rise of China is explained by them stopping the stupid policies that Mao imposed. This was a great civilization with great people, great learning, great possibilities, and the Communist Party ran it into the ground for 40 years, and then they stopped running it into the ground. So we couldn't have prevented the rise. Could we have responded to it differently? Sure. Could we have done things that could have mitigated the effects on these specific cohorts of people? Sure. We could have done that with more aggressive TAA, more generously funded TAA, more aggressive use of other social safety nets. I was struck interviewing Bob Zellick for the book in terms of what could we have done differently. And he, what he said was back in the Bush years, instead of being as patient as we were with the Chinese, because the view at the time was any sluggishness in implementing promised reforms was just evidence of the difficulty of getting the government mobilized and dealing with some very tough domestic issues on their side, that we should have, as it became clear that reform momentum was ebbing and that the reformers inside the government no longer had the whip hand, we should have gone to China with a new agenda of specific reforms. Tackle subsidies, tackle currency, do this, with a short, concise laundry list, and focused our energies on mobilizing them to do that. Now, whether that worked or not, as you say, hindsight is 2020, but what we do know is the path that we took got us here. So I take that as prima facie evidence that we should have done something else.
Well, think about the politics of it again for a minute. In the Goodyear example, the tire example you talked about, the tariffs didn't make a lot of difference in the end. They cost about $900,000 in higher tire prices for each job saved, and they had hurt American consumers via higher prices, and also farmers, because the Chinese retaliated. Farmers always get the short end of the stick when it comes to trade retaliation. So you could say in the abstract that, well, better adjustment assistance was the answer, but that's not what the workers were demanding. In fact, that's not what the workers wanted. The workers wanted protection. I mean, how do you respond to that in a political environment if you're a politician? Tell the workers they're wrong and they should do something, get something else?
No. Obviously, if you're getting beat up, you want somebody to stop the beating. You don't want to hear a policy statement on what can make things better 6 months or a year from now. My point, two things. I don't think you can have it both ways on the safeguard tariffs, because as you know, Charlene Barshevsky spent a lot of time and effort negotiating that provision into the accession terms for China to join the WTO. And that was billed at the time for workers as the safety valve, that if this process, this phenomenon works to your disadvantage, look, we've got these safeguard tariffs, we've got China to agree to our right to impose them for a lengthier time than was customarily the case with other developing countries, so you're protected. You don't have to worry about it. And then when the flood of imports happens, to turn around and say, well, these safeguard tariffs aren't worth anything. So was it sold on the basis of a fraud, or should we have used the safeguard tariffs earlier in a more aggressive way to get China's attention? There were 4 cases, I think, where the Bush administration rejected them for the reasons that you rightly point out. These are not, there's no silver bullet to any of these problems. There's no cost-free remedy. It's just a question of how you want to absorb your costs. And the way we proceeded led us to a world where we've absorbed our costs now, in my view, by ending up in a place where trade liberalization has been off the agenda for 10 years, and where populism is run amok, and the U.S. has turned its back on the system that made it wealthy, and has moved away from its leadership in the global economy. That, to me, is a cost, too. So it just depends on how you account for these costs.
One of the points you make today, and one of the points you make in the book, is that the growing problem of inequality in the U.S., wealth inequality, income inequality. But say a little bit more about, you said you're not a fan of single variable solutions. Say a little bit more about the other variables that are involved here. It's not just trade. What else is contributing to the problem?
The problem of inequality.
Yeah.
Well, globalization's part of it. even proponents of globalization like Larry Summers have written and spoken about this. This phenomenon has worked well for in particular for educated people in the coast, primarily in the coast, creating jobs that they benefit from in a way that has not been the case if you're a less skilled, less educated worker. Now, I don't think anybody expects that you could run an advanced economy or an economy of any size and keep 100% of the people happy 100% of the time. That's not going to be in the cards. But the concentrated economic losses acted like economic and political tumors, and nothing was done to address those. And, I was struck to go back to the Goodyear example. During this period, during a couple of years there where things were really tough for the plant, they were laying people off, one chunk at a time. It was on the eve of the financial crisis. And over, I think, roughly 3 years, the salary of the Goodyear CEO doubled from about $10 million a year to $20 million a year. That kind of stuff sticks in the craw of workers too, and that's why I do move away from the single variable. They look at a system that's not working. The injuries they suffered as a consequence of the China shock, I think of, to use the pandemic language, as pre-existing conditions, because then those people in those communities a few years later are hit by the global financial crisis, aggravated, as I explained, by global capital flows. They feel that they get the short end of the stick out of that again, while the bankers, quote unquote, get off scot-free. And then you have the weakest recovery of the post-war era because of in my view, inappropriate, premature turn to austerity. And so people suffer. It takes, I think, 6 years to get the unemployment rate back down to where it was. So it's a series of things that are aggravating these conditions and that leave people, I think, resentful, which has political consequences.
I was going to ask you about that. It may have been a premature return to austerity, but looking back on it right now and looking at our debt burden right now, aren't we actually better off for the austerity? We'd be even deeper in the hole today.
Well, I think it's a hard argument to make, actually, to say it's a good thing we had the weakest recovery in the post-war era and the people suffered for several years, just so our debt to GDP ratio today is a little bit lower than it otherwise would have been, which sort of grandfathers in all the spending, right or wrong, that we've done over the last 8 years and the tax cuts. The reality is you have to respond as a policymaker in the moment. And the issue is not, in my view, whether in 2009, 10, 11, you should have been thinking, well, gee, in 2020, there'll be an administration that'll do this and that. I should husband my gunpowder for that day. You've got an economy that's in crisis. You've got people that need help. You've got people that need jobs. And to shrink the deficit for 6 straight years, to have the government at a time when the economy is almost crippled, have the government reducing demand and economic activity rather than contributing it to it, I think is a mistake.
That's a whole other book, I think.
If anybody wants to sign me up to write that book, I'm available.
As a longtime deficit hog, I don't completely agree with you. But anyway, it's almost your turn. I've got 2 more quick questions, and then we'll turn to the audience. First one is kind of a wild card, because you don't really talk about it in the book, is what's your verdict on TPP? Should we have gone ahead with it, or was Trump right to pull out?
I think, I'll say this. I think having negotiated it, it doesn't make sense. Let me put it in the words of the people in the region, because I still have to write about these people. The impact of pulling out the way we did at the time we did was to make the United States look like an unreliable negotiating partner and trade partner. And at a time when we're certainly in a contest with China for influence and trying to attract China's neighbors to our side of the debate, that was not helpful. And I suspect the economic impact, and the Trump people who I've spoken to about this would disagree with me. I suspect the economic downside to that would not have been as significant as they think, but they do think it would have been significant.
Yeah. Okay, final question. And one of the things that's happening right now is what might be called the backlash to the backlash. The folks at some of our think tanks, not primarily this one, but some of our neighbors are basically back defending the era of globalization, defending what's happening, saying all these people are wrong, the Trump people are wrong. What's your thoughts on the backlash to the backlash?
Yeah, I think, as you say, those efforts have been done at places like Cato and the Peterson Institute. And
You get to mention them. I'm not going. I don't.
no. I mean, I think I talked to all those folks and think highly of them, and I think, I think what they're saying is true and necessary, and it's good to get those facts out in the debate. But I think there are different lenses to look at these issues through. One is a strict economic, factual, objective. If we were at a seminar at Yale, who gets the A on the test answer. And then there's the political economy reality, which is what I said earlier. You need to get elected in Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan. And so you need an answer. If you're someone who supports trade liberalization, which I know you are, and which these folks at the think tanks I mentioned are, if that's your goal, in my opinion, it's insufficient to just tell people the same thing you've been telling them, but tell them louder. Globalization's good. It's going to make us all richer. Winners and losers. Can't turn back the clock. There's no going back to the economy of the 1950s. Yes to all the above. But you've been saying that for 10 years. You've been saying that for 30 years, in fact. And we are where we are. And in my view, there's no going back to 2015. So you need to update that argument with something that addresses in a more concrete way the concerns that people have, rightly or wrongly. And I know a lot of those folks will say, look, automation's responsible for most of the manufacturing job loss. Yes, it is. You'll get different estimates from economists on whether that's 50, 75, 80%. But yes, automation is most of the problem. But if 4 guys jump me on my way to the subway tonight, beat the crap out of me and take my wallet, I want all 4 prosecuted. I don't want just the 3 guys who were the biggest to go to jail. I want them all prosecuted. So I think it's insufficient to kind of wave off the trade component and say most of this is automation. So you're not upset. You shouldn't be upset about trade. You should worry about automation. And there's nothing we can do about that because none of us are Luddites. You got to meet people where they are. We spend a lot of time in the Biden administration watching officials try to tell people inflation wasn't a problem. Don't worry about inflation. This is going to be gone in a few months. That didn't work out. Now the Trump administration's trying it with the labor market. The jobs will be here in a year, the president said the other day. Don't worry that they're not hiring now. Don't worry that unemployment's creeping up. Jobs will be here in a year. I don't think that's going to be any more successful than telling people not to worry about inflation. You have to meet people where they are.
Okay, let's turn to the audience. Any questions? I hope. Yes, right here in the front row. Somebody will come around the mic. Please tell us who you are and ask a question. Don't give a speech.
All right, I'll try not to. My name is Ann Broom, I'm just a person attending. I was wondering, you hit it, and thank you very much for your presentation. You kind of hit my point in your last remarks. You mentioned that, for example, Biden and Clinton, and I would include President Obama, all talked about the problem of CEO pay inequities, etc. At the same time, Reagan and the 2 President Bushes both talked about problems of offshoring jobs, etc. In both cases, it was, I think the impression was it was a lot of rhetoric more than reality. I mean, CEO salaries went astronomical during the Obama administration. The Rust Belt went really rusty during the Reagan administration. And during those times, there was a segment of people who said, here are all the downsides you're creating. But because of the rhetorical politicization of the dialogue, those people were castigated, for example, as, populists or this or that. And then the adverse consequences happened, and it's like we just, let's not look back, let's move forward. Do you see that? I see that happening, again, it was Reagan and 2 Bushes, it was Clinton and Obama and Biden. same thing happening again and again in terms of not having a full discussion of actual productive remedies. And I see it happening again, where it's sort of like, if Trump, suggests a remedy, it must be bad because he's Trump and we politicize it.
Can we get to the
Do you ever see
question?
that changing? Is there a way to allow a more two-sided discourse so that we can look at what's good about tariffs as well as what may be the downsides?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I mean, I'm not given to being wildly optimistic about anything, let alone the state of our political discourse. But one of the goals I had for the book, and I don't know whether I've made it or not, we'll find out as more people read it, was to try and inject some nuance into this discussion. Because, and I will say, to the extent that I covered all this stuff, and Bill and I have been talking about trade since I moved back from China in 2005, I was a believer in the conventional wisdom, and I tell stories in the book about having been in Indonesia in 1998 as Suharto fell, which was a function of the IMF conditions for assistance during the Asian financial crisis. I was in Russia the following year when the crisis spread. So I was seeing some of these downsides in real time, and I will confess I did not integrate them into a sort of holistic view of there are problems here that go beyond the specifics of what's happening this week in Indonesia or this week in Moscow. So, to the extent I'm critical of other people, I'm critical of myself as well. I did not have as sophisticated a view of this whole phenomenon as perhaps I should have. But I also think that the answer to these problems is not to go full bore in the other direction and throw up walls and try and isolate yourself. And I think President Trump has been given justified credit for diagnosing some problems, whether in the economy or foreign policy in general, on occasion. But the remedies are, he's got a fondness for tariffs that I described in one story as he regards them as the Swiss Army knife of diplomacy and economic policy making. Whatever the problem is, it can be cured by a tariff. I don't think the economic evidence is going to bear him out on that. Part of my goal is, Bill Clinton spoke at one point of putting a human face on the global economy. I'm, in part, trying to find a way to make the world safe for globalization, and try and look at these issues honestly and get to a place where we can address ills with appropriate medicine and not chemotherapy if a Tylenol will do the trick.
One over here in the first row. Tell us who you are and ask a question.
My name is Jeff Anderson. I'm a professor at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, and I go way back with Dave.
I was going to say we've planted a ringer here because Jeff and I go back about 40 years.
Right? Yeah, great book. I'm really looking forward to read it. I have a question for you about the politics, and this picks up on something you said during your prepared remarks that kind of charting out a vision for how we might approach these problems in the future. Of maybe an overly sympathetic reading of the Biden administration's policies and this notion of meeting people where they are, was that there was an attempt to help the losers of globalization through policies like the IRA and the CHIPS Act, which had really, for the first time since the 1930s, had a heavy place-based component to it, right? Targeting the distressed areas, the ones who had lost, the disheartened, and the payoff for that in the election was effectively zero.
Yep.
In fact, these places many of them went even harder for Trump in 2024. So did the Biden administration just not get it right, or is there something else that has to be done when the origins of the problem are economic, as you very eloquently point out, but the manifestations of the politics is cultural? It's about immigrants, it's about crime, it's about,
Yep.
DEI and these sorts of things. What do
Yeah,
you do?
no, that's a good question, and what you said is completely true. And a lot of those Biden policies, the grants under the IRA and the CHIP stuff, were targeted at red districts. I remember Janet Yellen, as Treasury Secretary, going out to I think it was a battery factory in Kentucky, in a district. I don't think the Democrats had any hope of they could put a battery factory on every corner, and I don't think they'd win that district. But I think the administration was also slow, and it wasn't all under their control, of course. But, they signed the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which was a big achievement. Infrastructure Week had become a punchline under the first Trump term. But now those programs are out there with big signs on it that say, new bridge, courtesy of President Donald J. Trump. Because the Biden administration was so slow to get things going. And, I do think, and some of this, I suppose, probably speaks to that abundance agenda that Ezra Klein and Dylan Thomas have written about. And I haven't read the book, so I can't comment on that. But the sluggishness at getting from idea to legislation to actual groundbreaking to hiring people, I think the lesson of the Biden years and the lesson of the marketing genius that Trump has, which is this relentless when he decides to hammer an issue or a person, it's all you hear about. The message is repeated over and over and over again in a way that I think makes most people want to throw up their hands and turn the TV off. But it does have the desired effect. And so, speed and marketing, it may not be the sexy stuff that policy wonks like to talk about, but it comes down to the political impact.
Did you have one here in the front row? We have time just for a couple more. And David's going to stay and sign books, so you can catch him later if we don't have time to do it here.
Great. My name is Peter. I'm a graduate student at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown. And my question relates to artificial intelligence. You discussed the growing and globalizing services sector, and you also brought up the implications of AI and how that will, in part, shape, this new era of globalization and shape a lot of the new challenges we have to contend with. How would you go about applying the suggestions that you had for alternate policy approaches in the past to this new era, especially related to the implications of AI for the services sector?
Yeah, well, I think thanks for that. I think it comes down to trying to do this time what we didn't do last time. In other words, we see a shock coming, and I'm not the world's greatest expert in AI, so there's no reason you should listen to me talk about this subject at all. But we all know that the estimates are all over the map, that AI is already affecting some prospects for entry-level employment of recent college graduates, up to it's going to eliminate X percent of white-collar work over a short period of time. Nobody knows at the moment, but you will see prominent figures who are developing artificial intelligence and know far more about it than I do, who are saying this is already affecting things. And to me, I look at AI like any technology as there's going to be a disruptive period that's going to require a response, but eventually it will make life better, right? Because you think about the iPhone, right? The iPhone has created all kinds of jobs that when I was your age, we couldn't have even imagined. Apps did. Go back to 1970 and tell somebody you're going to be an app designer, they'd have no idea what you're talking about. So it's created whole new industries. AI will do the same thing. But the issue is, over what period of time is this disruption going to happen, and is the creation of new opportunities going to keep pace with the dislocation of people who are made redundant? So I would like to see some government response to that today, some looking ahead and saying, okay, well, if that happens, what are the policies we're going to wish we had in place? Would we want wage insurance? Would we want extended unemployment like we had during the pandemic? You know, that was costly, and there were business people who didn't like it because they thought it was a disincentive to work, but it also allowed households to maintain their level of consumption, which is good for the overall economy, 50% longer than they otherwise would have been able to. So that's a big societal benefit for whatever the cost was. So I would want to see some government action on that today. Figure out what makes sense to do, and do a little policy experimentation. That's something that we don't do a lot of. We've got sort of an on switch or an off switch, and I'd rather do what countries like Denmark do, which is roll out something on a small scale, see if it works. If it does, great. Duplicate it, replicate it at scale. If it doesn't, get rid of it, move on to the next thing.
Well, we're over time, way over time, so I'm going to have to say sorry. But David's going to stick around to buy the book, to sign the book, buy the book. It's excellent. People with more questions, grab him on the way out. I assume you're willing to have conversations.
Whatever moves the merchandise.
So thank you very much.
Happy to stick around.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thanks. That was good.
That was fun.
Yeah.
So